So a couple little just side notes here to start with. Make sure you grab the clipboard. There's a clipboard with PGA points. I know the MSR cycle is coming up here in the end of, I think it's June this year is when the cycle ends. So make sure you grab the clipboard that's floating around. Put your PGA number on there. We'll get you some points so no one goes Class F. That would not be a good thing. Well, I'm excited to listen to Allison. It's been 15 years I've known you now? Something like that? 10 to, anyway. Many years ago, Golf Tech coach to start with, and it's been fun to watch her career just go crazy over the last 15 years. So great to have you here. Looking forward to hearing it. Certainly a very different, how to say, level of certification as well as just background and education than most golf professionals. So it's super exciting. So we've got a lengthy bio here that we'll go through. So be patient with me on this one. So Allison is a PGA Master Professional in Instruction as well as an LPGA Class A member, one of only 11 women to achieve the highest PGA credential as a Master Professional in Instruction. Has over 28 years of golf competition background as well, two-time All-American, playing on a full scholarship at Florida State University while earning degrees in psychology and professional golf management. After turning professional in 2004, Allison moved to Palm Springs and began teaching and professional playing career while working at top resorts and clubs in the desert. In 2007, she arrived at Sherwood Country Club as the teaching professional and first assistant and spent 7 years overseeing all programs related to men, women, and juniors, in addition to running and coordinating the teaching camps and clinics. In 2017, 15, and 12, she was voted by her peers in the LPGA as the Western Section Teacher of the Year. Allison was voted the LPGA's National Teacher of the Year in 2015. Additionally, in 2015, she won the Southern California Northern Chapter Teacher of the Year. In 2016, she was honored with the following awards: GRAA Top 50 Growth of the Game Teacher, Southern California PGA Teacher of the Year, Northern Chapter of the Southern California Section Club Fitter of the Year, and Golf Digest Best Young Teachers. The LPGA selected Allison as a top 50 teacher in their inaugural list in 2017, and GRAA recognized her again as a top 50 Growth of the Game teacher. The SCPGA inducted Allison into the Teaching Hall of Fame in 2017. You're too young for Hall of Fames. Come on. She currently teaches at Wood Ranch Golf Club in Los Angeles and is a consultant to the California State University Northridge Women's Golf Team. This is the other half of the education that fascinates me as well. So Allison completed her master's degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis in marriage and family therapy from Pepperdine University. You certainly hear plenty of marriage and family issues when you're on the lesson to you, so I think it's a nice combination there. Therapist and licensed professional clinic counselor in the state of California and currently works with adolescents, couples, families, and individuals at the Curt Performance Therapy in Woodland Hills. Allison strives to develop and coach golfers in all areas of their lives as she continues to work on her doctoral degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis in sports psychology from California Southern University. Allison continues to also play very actively as well, having been competitive in 4 LPGA Tour Championships and competed in the 2012 and 2014 Wegmans LPGA Tour Championship. She earned the 3rd and 4th major berth and competed in the 2015 and 2017 KPMG Women's PGA Championship. As the first female to ever qualify from Southern California, Allison will be competing in the 2018 PGA National Championship as well, and her 5th KPMG Women's PGA Championships. She was a 2016, 2017 Omega Southern California PGA Women's Player of the Year. Here to discuss the art and science of bilateral stimulation and other psychological tools used in golf instruction, Allison Curt.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow, hearing that bio, feel like maybe I need a vacation. But I'm actually really excited to share some interesting information with you that I'm pretty positive you've never heard before. Part of that is because I'm one of the only individuals in the world with my background doing this type of work. And so after your session today, I think you're going to walk away with really opening your eyes to some interesting psychological tools used in golf instruction and that are going to continue to be used in golf instruction. And maybe you'll also walk away with a little bit of yourself being healed or knowing how to heal yourself from some of the events that have maybe occurred in your life. So our plan for today is I'm going to share a little bit of my background. Andy pretty much had a pretty comprehensive list of what I do, but I'm going to give you a little bit of context of how I've gotten to where I am between these two worlds of golf and psychology. We're going to talk a little bit about what trauma and athletic trauma is. So after today, you're going to have a different perspective of what that actually means in the context of golf and golf performance. And then I'm going to share with you a really interesting psychological modality called EMDR. Some of you may have heard it before. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. We're going to learn about tapping, the title of the presentation, Tapping into Your Best Golf. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion of some other psychological tools that you as golf instructors and coaches will be able to use with your students and also maybe improve your performance aspect if you're still involved in playing. There's a resource supplement on the table. If we have time, we'll go over that, but you're more than welcome to use those supplements in your teaching and coaching business and share those with your students. So as Andy mentioned, I sort of have these three perspectives in my life. I'm definitely a player. I'm a teacher, but I'm also a psychotherapist. And part of how that all bridged together is through my own personal struggles, my own personal traumas, and realizing that I had an expectation of where I wanted to be in life, but I was having some struggles and some obstacles and some adversity to get there. So as a collegiate player at Florida State University, I realized that I ended up being a big fish in a small pond and turned into this little fish in a big pond. And everybody was as equally as competitive, if not better than me, when it got to the golf course. And there was something that really separated the great players from me, and that was what was in between the ears. How I handled myself on the golf course, how I regulated my emotions, how I was able to overcome adversity on the golf course. And there were certainly quite a bit of failures that I had carrying with me that created a lot of baggage, emotional baggage, when it came to playing. And so I became exposed to sports psychology and really got into how to handle stuff that had happened to me. And that started to spike my interest of like, what role does psychology really play in performance? So after having tons of failures in college and not reaching anywhere to what I had set as my goals, I entered into teaching and coaching because I still felt very fulfilled and very passionate about helping other people reach their goals. And after suffering a huge loss in 2006 when my own personal house burned down and I lost everything that I owned except for what I was wearing, I really felt this heavy sense of burden of like something's holding me back. And that sort of created a very clean slate because I literally had nothing besides my memories and who I was as a person, but I had no tangible belongings. And so as Andy mentioned, I started working for Golf Tech, and that really inspired working with players and helping other teachers become their best and learning what happened in their life to make them who they are today. So I decided to go back to graduate school and get a degree in clinical psychology, and through that degree became a licensed therapist. We all know as teachers and coaches, when our students come to us, we learn a lot about their personal life. You might have a student who's late to the lesson tee, and perhaps they were having an argument with their spouse. You might have a player who's heading to the first tee, and they're not having great communication with their caddy that particular week. And I really wanted to understand what caused people to tick, and what can I do to help them move past that in order to perform better. And so I'm also in the final stages of my dissertation, should be finished about 2 months, which is a little bit about what I'm talking about today, and how trauma and things that have happened in our past influence our performance. As teachers and coaches, we are faced with a lot of performance issues, and sometimes we can just refer our students out to other clinicians and other specialists, but you also can become equipped in how to work with your students to improve their performance. Athletic traumas, you're going to hear that a lot today. You're going to be familiar with what an athletic trauma is. Communication, how parents are talking to their children, how caddies are talking to their players, and how us as professional deliverers of messages, how we communicate to our students. Those are issues that come up in performance. Certainly goal setting. If we don't know how to help our students set goals, I think we're missing the mark. How to handle emotions. So when you have a high schooler who's suffering from anxiety playing and they're acting out on the golf course, what can you do to help them be able to regulate what's happening on the inside? self-confidence. Had a lot of students come to my lesson tee say, I'm just not confident in what I'm doing. So what can we actually do on a deeper level to help instill confidence? Concentration. We certainly live in a world of multiple distractions. I see a lot of players on the range with headphones on, using social media and practicing all at the same time. So there's tons of distractions that we're faced with in our life, and I think all of us can learn to how to improve our concentration a little bit better, and we can certainly teach that skill to our students. How to relax in pressure situations, whether that's the first tee, whether that's closing out a tournament, whether that's preparing for a professional speech. How can we learn how to be relaxed in pressure situations? The yips. Yips, shanks, poor performance. How do we handle anxiety-based disorders? And finally, imagery and visualization. I think there's been a lot of talk about that as of late with the advent of focus band and seeing some professional players actually go through some imagery and visualization while competing. We certainly need to have the skills to be able to teach that to our students. So I want you to think back in your history as a competitor and find an incident where maybe you failed. So for me, I would think back to being a senior in high school and leading the state championship and scoring a 7 on the last hole to finish second. So I want you to think about a personal experience for you, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. From that experience, have you ever had any distressing memories about that failure? Maybe right now as you're pulling up that memory. Have you ever had any dreams about that failed performance? Maybe it recurs after a couple of years where you wake up and you're in a cold sweat thinking about that failed performance. Have you ever had any flashbacks? Maybe you're just going about your day and all of a sudden that image of that failed performance pops into your mind. Suffered any anxiety or nervousness about being in a scenario where that might happen again? When you think back to that failed performance, do you have any intrusive thoughts or any sort of upsetting feelings when thinking about that? Have you ever avoided trying to think about those memories or avoided the feelings that you actually get when you think about that trauma experience? Sometimes this might show up as like talking excessively on the golf course, or some people might smoke to calm their nerves, or they might drink to calm their nerves, but doing things to avoid what that distressing memory brings to you. Maybe you've avoided the situation altogether, so you don't return back to that particular golf course where that incident happened, or you try to make sure that you don't get in that position again. This is actually the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can imagine that some of the things that have happened in your playing careers could actually fit the criteria for a diagnosis that is used in clinical psychology. Now, that's not saying that any of you in this room are suffering from PTSD, but it's showing you that how impactful some of our negative life events are and how much distress it can bring us, and that's certainly going to impact our performance moving forward. I want to show you a short 3-minute video here of some examples of what golf trauma is. Now, hopefully that video didn't traumatize any of you, but that's certainly a collection of maybe some famous or notable instances of some pretty epic failures on the golf course. You can certainly get trauma by proxy, so I have to be careful watching this video too much, make sure I don't see those three putts move, three putts integrate into my brain too much. But for the context of those particular players, some of those missed putts, some of those errant shots are huge life changers for those players. If golf is their bread and butter and that's what puts food on the table for their family and they have expectations and performance goals and they four-putt, that's huge. That's a huge loss for them. So what is really trauma? Well, the definition of trauma in the dictionary is really just a deeply or distressing event. So it seems pretty encompassing of a lot of different things that we might encounter as humans. Well, in 1994, the American Psychological Association really started to put some boundaries on what trauma is. And this was a distressing event that really threatened someone's bodily integrity, the safety of their body, like life and death sort of situations, and really caused fear, hopelessness, and a sense of their well-being really being taken away from them. So that wouldn't really seem like it applies to anything that happens on the golf course. But in 2013, the APA sort of modified what that definition is, and I think it's much more encompassing of what we experience as human beings. And so this is a deeply disturbing event that really interferes with a person's ability to cope with the environment. So the situation becomes so overwhelming that a person may not be able to integrate what has happened in reality into their own world. They may not be able to cope with the emotions, and they may not be able to heal from it with their own skill set. So this certainly seems much more encompassing of what could happen for an athlete on the golf course. Certainly it's a mix between one's personal vulnerability and how severe the trauma is, which is why we're all different in this room in terms of how resilient we may be. So my experience being a senior in high school and having a triple bogey on the last hole to lose the state championship may be super important to me, but it may not be very important to you. A three-putt on the last hole to lose the professional national championship may be huge for another player, but for a spectator it may not mean anything. So there's certainly a lot of subjectivity when it comes to traumas because how impactful it is to us as a person. So as we look at athletic trauma, adverse experiences that happen in the context of performance, trauma is really broken up into two large groups: big T trauma and small t trauma. Big T trauma are going to be those events that you commonly associate with trauma already: plane crashes, terrorist attacks, violent assaults against your person. Those are the events that we really feel like our life is threatened. And we're going to consider those big T traumas. Small T traumas, on the other hand, are the adverse life experiences that are huge losses, feelings of shame or embarrassment. These may be divorce. This may be losing a golf tournament. This may be losing a loved one. It may be communication between another person that you love that went really poorly. Or if you've ever gotten fired from a job and your ego was completely crumbled. These are going to be those small T traumas. And small T traumas can have just as big of an impact as a big T trauma. So when looking at the diagnosis of PTSD, we're commonly thinking of people who have gone to war, people who have been assaulted. Those would be the sufferers of PTSD. But small T trauma actually can also cause symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which means there certainly can be some performance hindrances when you go back onto the golf course to compete. Statistics show that 90% of individuals will experience at least one trauma in their lifetime. That's a pretty large percentage. That means almost everybody in this room, who hasn't experienced a trauma yet, will experience a trauma. And experiencing multiple traumas is actually the norm. So when you think of some of these small T traumas, divorce, legal troubles, maybe you've already had a couple of those experiences in your life. So now that we understand a little bit of what trauma means in the context of athletic trauma, what are some of the side effects? What are some of the causes that are going to impact performance moving on. I think no one can deny the fact that after Jordan Spieth knocked a couple of balls in the water at the Masters, and then he returned next year, something was going to happen on that hole. Unless he had some form of mental coaching, or he perhaps went through EMDR, something was going to happen on that hole again, and sure enough he did. He knocked it in the water again. So that hole became a trigger for him. And you see that across the board with Dustin Johnson missing short putts in pressure situations after the U.S. Open. That's got to shake up his system. And that's going to create a memory that certainly hinders performance moving forward. So the effects of small T trauma can certainly be decreases in self-esteem, difficulty in regulating emotions moving forward, anxiety-based disorders. It can certainly be a cause of the yips, feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. So the effects of small T traumas can be just as severe for you as an individual as large T traumas. So in order to understand how tapping into your best golf is going to be useful for you, we need to understand a little bit about how trauma is then stored in the brain. So I've got a very useful hand model of the brain that we're all going to participate in, and this is actually developed by Dr. Dan Siegel. So everyone go ahead and hold up your hand. So as we look at the anatomy of the brain, this area running up your forearm, we're going to call that our spinal cord. Now, as our spinal cord goes into our wrist area and our lifeline, we're going to call that our brain stem. If you take your thumb and you wrap it in, we're going to call this our limbic system. Our thumbnail, that's going to be our amygdala. Now, what does the limbic system and the amygdala do? Some of you may have heard of the amygdala with fluid motion factor and how it impacts performance, but the limbic system works in conjunction with the brainstem to regulate emotion. Now you're going to take your hand and you're going to wrap it over. This is the cortex, like the outer layer, the outer shell of your brain. And the cortex helps us perceive the outer world. If you turn your hand to the side, when you have the front of these knuckles here, that's your prefrontal cortex right behind your forehead. And that's in charge of controlling all of this stuff underneath, the limbic system, but it's also in charge of making decisions and logic. So you can imagine if you become so overwhelmed, you can literally flip your lid. Has anyone ever had so much rage, so much anger that you couldn't think clearly? If you haven't, you may not be human. We've all at some point have experienced an influx of emotion where our prefrontal cortex and our cortex wasn't able to think logically and be in control. And so literally you just blow up in your mind. You don't know what to do. If you know how to regulate certain parts of your brain, well, then you can sort of overcome that emotion and your cortex can be in charge. When trauma occurs, there's a lot of different details that get stored. So you remember that fingernail part, that's your amygdala. That's basically the storekeeper of the emotional components of memories. So when you have an event happen to you, you have a picture of the memory, you have an emotion of the memory, you have a sensation in your body of what it felt like in the moment, and then you also develop a belief about yourself during that memory. And the amygdala holds the emotional component of it. It's also responsible for perceiving fear, aggression, wide variety of emotions. So when an event happens to you, you have all of these pieces of information that are coming into your brain, and then they just hang out there for a little bit. They hang out for the day. We're going to get into what happens at night in just a moment. Depending on how aroused you are in your brain, how elevated you are with emotions, will dictate whether that memory is processed adaptively, which means that we can pull information from it and learn, or maladaptively, which means we don't learn anything from it. What that means is if you were ever a little child and you touched fire, you had a memory of that experience. Not only did it hurt, but maybe you felt shame because a parent said, hey, don't touch that. You might have remembered what the fire looked like. So you have all these components of the memory, and then your brain took out the pieces that were really important and stored them for your survival. Hey, don't touch fire anymore. But when it comes to a traumatic memory, your brain becomes so aroused that it's very, very difficult for that trauma to then be used in an adaptive way. When we look at what happens when we go to sleep at night, the information that's stored in our brain is in short-term memory. When we get to stage 4 of our sleep cycle, information is pulled out that is important. The hippocampus helps out with that, and it goes into long-term memory. So have you ever heard of that phrase like, oh, just sleep on it? Maybe something really big happened to you at work and you're trying to make a decision and someone says, oh, just sleep on it. And then you wake up the next day and you're actually a little bit more clear. Well, it's because your brain really helped you out and processed a lot of what was going on, pulled out pieces that were important. The emotional aspects may not be intense, so then you can make a logical decision the next morning. When you're in stage 4 and you're sleeping, if you've ever watched anyone sleep, you might notice that their eyes dart back and forth behind their eyelids. It's kind of like, what's happening in there? Well, it's the brain that's actually really doing a ton of work at that moment. And so when the eyes are moving back and forth, that's our REM sleep patterns. That's when that information is becoming consolidated. So that piece of information is going to be helpful as we move into the next slide when we talk about EMDR. Also, when you have these memories, they are then stored into networks. So they're sort of categorized in the brain for you to easily access information. So if I said the word apple, your brain would then go into categories of fruit, and you might think of bananas and watermelons and oranges. When you have experiences such as traumas or birthday parties or weddings, those will all get categorized in your mind. Maybe they're categorized as joyous family moments or places that I want to avoid because they threaten my safety. So these memory networks are really important because when you're looking at trauma, you're looking at maybe not just an isolated experience, but also other experiences in that same network. So the brain is definitely capable of processing stressful events. We do it every day. All of you have been stressed at some point in your life, and you're not traumatized by it. However, in those cases of extreme stress, or when the arousal is so elevated, your brain cannot process that traumatic memory. It's very difficult to. It can't pull out the information to say, this is helpful for me. Therefore, it's maladaptive. Traumas get stuck. They don't ever go to long-term memory. When they're stuck, they then become triggers. That means if I ever get into a situation that has the same sort of feel of where that trauma started, I'm going to relive and re-experience the sensations of when that trauma happened. So let's put this into the context of golf. This is an extremely short putt that Lexi Thompson has missed, talking like this big. So depending on what that meant to her and what that putt meant to her, anytime she gets into a scenario of pressure and she's about that far away, if that putt was traumatizing to her, she will relive the experience of what happened here until she's able to process it and use it in an adaptive way. An example of this in a non-traumatic way is if I say roses are red, your response would be, why? Does anyone know why that would just automatically come out? It's something that's learned. It's maladaptive. It's also turned into, because we've heard it so much, it's become into an automatic response. When I said roses are red, you just instantly in your brain, before you articulated it, was violets were blue. That's the same thing that happens to trauma. So it becomes a trigger, and it becomes an automatic trigger. Sometimes you may not have any logical reason why it's happening to your body, because it's so underneath all the layers, and it's an unconscious automatic response. So how does EMDR help this in order for you to tap into your best golf? Well, EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a psychological modality that's used in the treatment of trauma situations. And it basically means when a trauma happens to you, your brain cannot code it and cannot use it adaptively, so it gets stuck. And that's what causes symptoms in present day: anxiety, uncertainty, increased heart rate when you have no idea why. EMDR also looks at trauma in a three-pronged approach. What happened to you in the past causes your present-day scenarios, your present-day symptoms, and it will impact what happens in the future. So when using EMDR, it's certainly looking at stuff that's happened before to help what's happening now in order to prevent it from happening again in the future. Some of the alternatives of EMDR, which is basically a form of bilateral stimulation. Bilateral stimulation means we've got two hemispheres in our brain, and if we activate each hemisphere back and forth, we're bilateral stimulating. And that can be done through the eye movements, very similar to what happened in REM sleep. That can be done through tapping, which if you tap your body back and forth, or use a butterfly hug, tapping back and forth, you're stimulating the right and left hemispheres of your brain. EMDR has also been used for working with symptoms of anxiety, depression, group traumas. So for, let's say, hurricane relief, if there's a large group of individuals that have been traumatized by a hurricane, clinicians can come in and use EMDR in a group setting with everyone healing at the same time. But it's also been used and published in articles for Olympian athletes to help with the template for their performance. Seeing themselves perform in a productive and successful way before trauma happens, almost like building up a resilience before getting to a stressful situation. So how does EMDR work? Because it seems a little bit like I just move my eyes back and forth and all of a sudden my trauma just disappears. Well, it's a little bit more than that. But it's based on the premise of what happens with using the right and left hemispheres of your brain. When you recall a traumatic incident, all of the details of that incident are going to come up. The missed putt, the feeling you had in your body, the thoughts that you had about people judging you, the shame or embarrassment that you might have felt, and then the belief of maybe I'm a sucky putter. All of that starts to come up. If you tax your working memory at the exact same time, meaning that I'm holding the memory in mind, but I'm also doing something else, you can actually decrease the intensity of that memory. So what EMDR looks like is a therapist and a client sitting face to face with one another. They'll bring up an image of the worst part of the trauma. So let's say it's Dustin Johnson and it's missing the putt to go into forcing a playoff for the US Open. He would then bring up what the feelings he had in his body, he had at the time of the incident. He's going to bring up the belief he had about himself. Maybe it's I'm not good enough to force a playoff. And then the therapist is going to move his eyes back and forth, just like this. So as he's holding the memory in mind, the eyes are going to be moving back and forth. It's going to tax working memory, and the intensity of that memory will start to decrease. So it's not so fresh. It's not like an open wound anymore. Now, EMDR has 8 different steps in order to go through it. And in order to use EMDR, you have to be a licensed psychologist or a clinician. But I'm going to talk about a derivative of EMDR, which is tapping, which you can just use at any time for yourself, or begin to maybe talk to other students about incorporating it into their mental games. And that 8-phase approach really starts with, what are you experiencing right now? What performance issues are you having right now? Maybe it's anxiety and self-doubt. So as the season is starting to start up for the LPGA and the PGA, maybe a player comes to me and says, I'm really nervous about keeping my card this year and I have self-doubts about my driving. We're going to go back in history and we're going to look at what sort of events or failures might have created the situation for the anxiety and the uncertainty that they experience now. So we kind of create a hierarchy of these different traumas. And then we go through the treatment of EMDR. And then they're able to set a template for the future of how they would like to perform. Well, in the future, I'd like to perform with confidence with my driver. And in the future, I'd like to see my drives go straight. And all of this is happening by rewiring the beliefs and the thoughts about that trauma. So now tapping, kind of the title of this presentation, tapping into your best golf. So tapping can be used to process a trauma, but tapping can also be used to activate qualities, also known as resources, that you would like to use in the future to be successful. So let's talk about the first one, using tapping to desensitize a trauma. So there's some clients that might be vision impaired, or they might not be able to use their eyes to do the processing of EMDR. So tapping is still going to be another version of the bilateral stimulation. So you can still go through the same process of the EMDR treatment, but clients can have these TheraTappers in their hand, which sort of vibrate back and forth. They can do the butterfly hug, or they can just tap on their legs. How can you tap that's going to help you get into your best performance? If you think about the area of your game that you want to improve on, and you start to assess what qualities do you need in order to be successful, those are going to be called resources. So if I want to improve my putting stats for this year, and I know the qualities that I'm going to need are confidence and smooth tempo. Those might be my two resources that I'm going to try to tap into. I'm going to think back to times in my life when I actually have been successful with that smooth tempo, with that confidence. So I'm going to recall now positive memories of when I've been successful with that. And then I'm going to tap, just tapping gently back and forth, 8 to 10 times. You start to activate that resource. So you're creating a positive template in your brain now. Then through imagery, I'm going to imagine myself being in a tournament, putting really great, being confident, having great tempo, and tapping at the same time. That's tapping into a template for my success. So now when I get into that like or similar situation, my body's automatic response is to now respond successfully rather than to respond to any sort of traumas I've had in the past. So in this picture in the lower left, that's kind of an image, really neat to see a group of children tapping at the same time. So some of the world events that have happened, you can work with a lot of individuals all at once to help them decrease the intensity of their emotion, but also help them have some hope for the future. So I think the butterfly hug is actually really neat to see. Tapping on the knees just as you're sitting in your chair, using your fingers back and forth to tap. And then up in the top right corner, those are TheraTappers. They're just little massage, vibrating handles, if you will, that you hold on to, and they just vibrate back and forth in your hand. All are forms of bilateral stimulation. So if you'd like to try this for just a short minute, I'll certainly walk you through a protocol. And this is going to be tapping in to something for you to be successful in the future. So I'd like you to think back to an area of your game that you'd like to improve on. Maybe something for this year that you'd like to have a goal. Might be putting, might be chipping. So let's think of an area that you want to improve on. And then ask yourself, what qualities or resources are you going to need in order to improve that piece of your game? Okay. So once you have that, now I want you to go back in history and try to find a memory or a time when you actually have used those qualities to be successful. Okay, now when you think back to that memory, I'd like you to try to pull a lot of vivid information. What did it feel like? What did it look like when you were being successful? Using all senses, any sights, any sounds. What beliefs did you have about yourself when you're being successful? Okay, that's your resource. Now, holding that memory in mind, that positive memory, and all the pieces of it that are very vivid, that make you feel successful, just use your first two fingers and tap on your knees right and left, alternating back and forth for just a couple of moments. Okay. Now, what I want you to do is take those resources, those qualities that you need to be successful, and I want you to put them in the future. And imagine yourself competing and performing in that area of the game that you wanted to improve using those qualities. And then tap back and forth. Good. So for those that participated, what you can do is create more repetition with this and really get into the feelings of your body and the imagery in your mind to set the template for the future. So you've just begun to rewrite the template for your success. Doing this in a quiet space, really buying into and owning the different feelings that you have can certainly help you perform better in the future. So that's sort of tapping into your best golf. Now, other psychological tools used in golf instruction that relate to trauma certainly can make your toolbox of teaching and coaching much heavier, much more diverse, and also allow your students to have a much more fruitful relationship with you, because not only can you provide the service of giving them the best golf swing, but you can really help them on a deeper level. Sometimes when we're trying to activate those resources or think about those qualities that we really need to be successful, we need to create a hierarchy of times that we have been super awesome on the golf tours, times that we've been anxiety-free, times that we've really overcome adversity. So a confidence resume is one way for you to begin doing this. And it's basically just listing every golf club in your bag and going through the times in your life that you have hit those fantastic shots. Maybe it's a hole at Pebble Beach where you just striped a 4-iron and it landed 2 inches from the hole. You know, really recalling the memories and your positive resources so that when you are trying to tap into your best golf, you have a whole resume right here of all those different resources that have helped you been successful. We certainly want to look at our belief system, and you can access what your students believe about themselves through an exercise that I'm going to show you in a minute. But these beliefs are impacted by our traumas. They're certainly started in childhood, and they persevere throughout adulthood, but things that happen in our life will impact the schemas or beliefs that we have about ourselves. So you might know some people in your life who are just always like, I'm not good enough at anything. Well, usually there's something that has happened in their life that has caused them to have this feeling or belief. So how do you find out what someone's belief is about themselves? You can have them go through this exercise. Form up some statements, leave the adjective blank, and then have them fill in the very first word that pops into their mind. No filtering, no assessing, no writing down, what do I think the other person wants to hear, but just the natural gut reaction. I was actually testing this out on one of my roommates this week, and I said, hey, if I gave you the statement, I am a blank bunker player, what would you say? She said, terrible. So I knew right away that was her belief about her bunkers. So you can have your students fill this out, and then you really get to know how they feel about themselves. Now here's a tip. If they write good or okay, I'm a good putter, I'm okay at driving, that means ambivalence. So they're not really sure one way or the other. Those are the areas to certainly start from. And how to help them build up their confidence will be your job. Certainly using positive self-statements can begin to rewire those scripts that we have built into our system. And one way that I like to show the power of positive statements, especially in a group setting, great for junior camps, is using statements while performing an activity that's kind of benign. So tossing balls into a basket. I'll take 10 balls, put a basket 10 feet away, and I'll instruct the group to toss the balls into the basket, but using negative self-statements. Things like, I'm not good enough, I'm going to miss this basket every time, I'm awful at this, and then they know how many balls go in the basket. They redo the exercise, but this time using positive self-statements. I'm super great at this, I'm a professional ball tosser, every ball's going to go in, and they note how many balls go in the basket. And sure enough, using the more positive self-statements are going to increase their performance. The more positive self-statements that they use, they can also influence those beliefs that have been impacted by those athletic traumas. Another tool that you can use and start to teach with your students is mindfulness. I think Focus Band is a really awesome tool that I've started to integrate into my clinical practice as well as my teaching and coaching. Being able to know what sort of hemisphere and what state of thinking the student is in is very helpful. Also being able to redirect attention in the moment when pressure is on, noticing not what my competitors are doing, where the water hazards are, but having a very clear mind on what I want to do. The best definition of mindfulness that I've heard is doing one thing at one time and knowing that you're doing it. That does not mean hitting range balls with earphones on and using social media and talking to your friend all at the same time. It's literally doing one thing at one time and knowing that you're doing it. And that can certainly help performance. It can also make sure when you have anxiety, you're not paying attention to the anxiety, you're paying attention to what's important in the moment. So a great tool to help your students perform better. So as my time is coming to an end for today, we have resources on the table, and there's one in particular that I'd like to share with you. Most of these are self-explanatory. The confidence profile, which is a couple pages back, it looks like a big spider web. This is really great to use if you're going to begin a coaching relationship with an athlete as an initial assessment. And you'll have them write on the outermost layer of that spider web areas of their game that they want to work on or they want to assess. That might include a combination of physical skills and mental skills. So one area might be driving, but then another area might be emotional regulation on the course. Then starting from the innermost portion of the spider web, they're going to shade in how confident they feel. And so using this as a baseline measurement, I can look at an athlete and say, all right, so driving you feel like you're a 6, but emotional regulation you feel like you're a 2. So then developing a plan to help them improve those scenarios, I can then re-administer the profile in a couple of months to see if we're making any sort of progress. So I like that performance profile. On the very last page, if you're interested in learning how to introduce mindfulness and learn how to meditate and have a quiet mind, there's a couple of links that I've added. Those meditations start as short as 2 minutes. So if you have trouble like just kind of jumping into how to meditate and how to clear your mind, just start with 2 minutes. That's a really good start. I've included a couple of bibliotherapy, as we call it in psychology, some resources that I think are very helpful for me personally as a player, but also I think that are easy reads for students to read. And so I'd suggest that you kind of include them in your library. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to really share something that's very personal to me in my professional teaching and coaching world. If you have any questions or you'd like to reach out and talk more, I'm certainly super stoked to talk about this subject. It's very near and dear to my heart. And so thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.